In 1991, Disney released their take on a 200-year-old French fairy tale called La Belle et la Bête. And by all accounts, they nailed it. In the opening scene, we watch a handsome young prince come face to face with an ugly old woman in need of help. The prince, looking at her with disgust, denies her request and rejects her. Right? And as you know, that's when the old woman kind of reveals her true identity, a powerful, beautiful enchantress. And as punishment for his wickedness, casts a spell on the prince, transforming him into a hideous beast. And the beast is a realist, right? He knows that people are drawn to what is beautiful and lovely and pleasant. He knows that for the ugly and for the disfigured, for the repulsive, the chances are slim to none that anyone would ever draw near, let alone love them. As the opening scene comes to a close, the narrator tells us, ashamed of his monstrous form, the beast concealed himself inside his castle. If he could learn to love another and earn her love in return, by the time the last rose petal fell, the spell would be broken. If not, he would be doomed to remain a beast for all time. As the years passed, he fell into despair and lost all hope, for who could ever learn to love a beast? Who indeed? It's a rhetorical question. The implied answer is, of course, no one. It's not possible. Beast certainly doesn't think so. He later in the movie, in the song "Something There," he kind of sings about that same doubt and cynicism, right? He says, she glanced this way, I thought I saw, and when we touched, she didn't shudder at my paw. No, it can't be. I'll just ignore. But then she's never looked at me that way before. And in the end, as we all know, those of us who have seen the movie, it's Belle's love given first. It's Belle's love given first that transforms him from hideous beast to handsome man, right? And I think it's that idea right there that has made Beauty and the Beast such a beloved story. Even G.K. Chesterton, you hear Bryce quote him all the time, who is a literary critic with a notoriously high standard. Even he said, there is the great lesson of Beauty and the Beast that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. I want to repeat that. There is the great lesson of Beauty and the Beast that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. G.K. Chesterton wrote that over 100 years ago. And I don't think we're all that much closer to learning that lesson, to be honest. That goes for Christians too. I think it just goes so much against our nature that it almost seems like illogical, right? In Pride and Prejudice, when we first meet Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, it's not hard to know like who is more lovable. Mr. Bingley is charming and friendly. Mr. Darcy is arrogant and entirely unlikable, right? There are even studies. I read a study that attractive people are more often looked at as trustworthy and kind, right? My point is simply that we learn from a young age to love what is lovely and to love those who are lovable. And against all that, seemingly against human nature, G.K. Chesterton says, actually, the great lesson of Beauty and the Beast is that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. We need to learn that lesson. You need to learn that lesson, if I can. I need to learn that lesson. It is so fundamental to the Christian faith that without it, you will find the Christianity so frustrating that you will eventually walk away from Christ or just not come to him at all. in our passage today, we see another of Jesus' miracles, right? Displaying once more that seemingly nothing lies outside of his jurisdiction, outside of his power to rule and control. But at this point, with all the miracles Jesus has already done that we've seen over the past several weeks, it's kind of hard to say what is more arresting here, like the miraculous healing of a serious skin disease, or the enormity of Christ's compassion and love for this man, that he would touch a leper. The narrator's question, who could ever learn to love a beast? In this passage, I think we see that question has actually been asked before, and has been answered before. So Jesus is continuing to travel around the region of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues as he went and performing miracles. And of course, all of that is to kind of proclaim what he said earlier, proclaim the good news about the kingdom of God that has come in him and through him. And here he's in another Galilean town, right? When this man with a severe case of leprosy comes up to him. And we're going to see a few things. We're going to see how Jesus interacts with the outcasts and the unclean. We're going to see how we Christians in the room, how we should look at and interact with other people's sins and ugliness. And if there are any non-Christian friends in the room, you are going to see how you should view yourself and how you should view Jesus. Okay? In order to see and appreciate like how radical what Jesus does here is, we do need to take a few minutes to get like a background, a basic understanding of two things: what leprosy was in the ancient world and how it affected the people of Israel, and two, the Jewish categories of clean and unclean, common and holy. Okay, so in biblical times, leprosy was a name used to cover a variety of different skin conditions, skin diseases. Some curable, some not. It was often disfiguring and debilitating. Sometimes it was deadly. But whether mild or severe, for an Israelite, it really was one of the worst things that could happen to a person. It was so serious, in fact, that God actually gave Israel laws concerning like what Israel was to do, what the nation was to do if someone contracted leprosy or was even just thought to have contracted it. Laws for that individual, and laws on what to do if it seemed to go away, right? And you can read about those in Leviticus chapter 13 and 14, which is in the Old Testament, if you're new. But just to give you an idea of like how miserable life was, I don't want to spend time in Leviticus 13 and 14 right now, but just give you an idea of how miserable life was for lepers in ancient Israel. I'll give you just a few. So first of all, this is before modern medicine, right? The ancient world's only defense against contagious diseases was social isolation, quarantine, right? Lepers had to live outside the camp or the city once they kind of stopped becoming a nomadic people, and right, so the disease wouldn't spread. Even their own families couldn't come to them if they wanted to bring them food. For example, they had to like prearrange a place to bring the food and then leave, and then the lepers would come and get it. They had to wear torn clothes. They had to tear their clothes. They had to wear a cloth over their mouth and cry out, "Unclean, unclean, unclean," so that everyone would know to keep their distance and instead of risking infection. And if their leprosy ever went away before they re-entered society, they'd have to go to the priest, right? And he would kind of act as like a health inspector, and they'd be examined thoroughly. And then finally, if declared clean, there were some certain offerings they had to give for their healing. And though these rules are heartbreaking, they're not heartless, right? Like, remember, God's laws are not only keeping an entire nation safe from widespread disease and death. They're also, God's laws are also teaching the people something about his holiness, his purity, and what it means to be a holy and pure people. So you have to realize, for the Jewish people, this is something I realized this past couple of weeks while I was studying this passage. The leprosy wasn't just about being sick with the disease. That actually, the physical nature of it wasn't actually the worst part. Notice how, unlike in chapter 4, where people are asking for healing, and Jesus is healing them, right? I'm thinking of when healings at Capernaum, chapter 4:38 down to chapter 5, right? They use the word healing. Jesus healed them. They asked for healing, okay? But the word healing doesn't occur in this passage. Instead, the leper asks not to be healed, but to be cleansed. And Jesus doesn't say, be healed. He says, be made clean. Well, that's interesting. Why is that? Well, okay, so the categories of common and holy, clean and unclean, okay? Under Mosaic law, everything was broken down into the common and the holy. Most things were common, okay? And in that category of common, the normal state of most common things was clean, okay? Yes, there were certain things that were always unclean. Certain foods for Israel were always unclean. Immorality was always unclean, right? Murder, adultery, homosexuality. Okay, these are always unclean. But otherwise, uncleanness was temporary. I didn't realize this till this week, but people or things became unclean often, just for a time. As a result of certain actions, many of those actions that made things unclean were unavoidable and sometimes good. For example, preparing a body for burial made you and the tools you used unclean. Sexual intercourse made you and the bed sheets unclean. An infectious skin disease, like leprosy, made you unclean. And yet none of these three examples are wrong. I think before this past couple of weeks, I had the category that, like, unclean was bad. It was wrong. Not necessarily. Now, all these things, tools and utensils, garments, a person, whether clean or unclean, they were considered common, okay? But then there's a smaller set of clean things that would be sanctified, that is to be made holy, to be set apart for God's use. Now these things are holy. They once were common, and now they are holy. Okay? And these holy things can be profaned if used improperly, and thus kind of revert back to common. But under no circumstance was something unclean to come into contact with something holy. There was a big deal. The unclean does not touch the holy. There are some things in life that just should never meet, that should just never touch. Cayenne pepper and coffee. I can personally attest to that. You can ask me about it later. It was a mistake. Dogs and chocolates, batteries and water, holy and the holy and the unclean. Okay? And we've already seen in chapters 1 and 4 that both the angels and the demons confess and know that Jesus is holy. So here he is, a holy man, touching a leper who is, by nature of his disease, unclean. That's not right, at least by the standards of the day. Why did he do that? Why did Jesus touch him? I mean, Jesus was able to speak a word and heal Simon Peter's mother, who was near death. Speak a word and heal the masses. Speak a word and cast out a demon from a man. Surely he could have spoken a word and simply healed this man of his leprosy, cleansed this man of his leprosy? Why did he touch him? I can think of two reasons. So remember the title of this sermon series, right? The Clash of Kingdoms. There are two kingdoms at odds here. And over the next month, we're actually going to the passages that we're preaching on over the next month. We're going to see Jesus frustrate again and again. We're going to see Jesus frustrate the Pharisees by not playing by their rules. He's going to do things that by their laws are not allowed, and they're going to call him on these technicalities. And he's going to use those moments to teach them that his kingdom is not of this world. He's going to use those moments to point out that the law of Moses always pointed to him in the first place, that actually he is Lord over these laws. And that's exactly what he does here. Remember, I told you when I was talking about some things that some rules about what lepers had to go through. According to the law, if the leprosy ever went away, a priest would have to go outside the camp to the leper, inspect them thoroughly to see if God really had healed them. Right? And then that leper would have to sacrifice offerings because, of course, Israel believed, rightly, I might add, that all healing came from God. So they would offer sacrifices. Well, notice that's not exactly what happens in this passage. Like, Jesus certainly doesn't break any laws. He fulfills the law, right? But let's be crystal clear on that. But look what he does. In verse 14, Jesus doesn't assume the role of a priest here. No, instead, he assumes the role of God. To an Israelite, God heals leprosy. Doesn't just go away. To an Israelite, God heals leprosy, and he heals leprosy. And he doesn't tell the man, unlike Leviticus chapter 14, he doesn't tell the man, go to the priest in order to be examined, see if it's healed or not, or if it's cleansed or not. No, he confidently tells the man, you are healed. You are cleansed, I should say. Sorry. Go and show the priest, right? The other reason I think he touched this leper is that there then and here now, all might know how deep and wide is the love and compassion of God in Jesus Christ for the outcast, for the rejected and despised, the unclean and the contagious. And I don't know if there are many non-Christians in this room, but if there are, I just want to ask you if you're still weighing the God of the Bible on the scale along with all the other kind of world religions, the gods of the other world religions. As you try to determine which God is the true one, have you ever come across a God who is as intimate and condescendingly humble and compassionate as this, yet retaining their purity? Right? I grant that the Greek gods engaged in intimate mingling far more than this. But you can't exactly say that like Zeus or Demeter were holy or imperfect, right? Or pure. You read the stories, they had as many flaws as we do. There is no one like our God. There's no one like the Christian God. There's no God like the Christian God, as compassionate as he is, and yet as pure and undefiled as he is. It's an awesome thing. Amen, indeed. Of course, as wonderful of a display of compassion and love as this is, I'm aware that most of us in this room don't have leprosy, don't need convincing that Jesus is kind and loving and compassionate towards the outcasts. Not to mention the fact that we don't observe the same laws about clean and unclean anymore. So, is this passage as powerful today as it once was? I suppose is a good question to ask. Well, we might not physically be lepers, but leprosy is as big a deal as as it was in the Bible. It's talked about, it's mentioned as often as it was in the Bible because it is such a graphic illustration of sin. Like leprosy, sin isolates us from each other and from God. Have you ever noticed how in your shame, when you do something you know is wrong, you pull back from community, and your guilt makes it hard, or you're unable to approach God. Like leprosy, sin desensitizes us to what is wrong and hurtful. Right? It would deaden their nerve endings, and it does that to us too, our hearts, our souls. I mean, have you ever noticed how the longer you continue to do things you know are wrong, the less it pricks your conscience, the less it bothers you, the easier it is to do it again. Historians have said that lepers used to be referred to as the walking dead. Okay, well, the Apostle Paul in his letter to the church in Ephesus says to them, "You were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked." The similarities between leprosy and sin are striking, and they're there on purpose. Now, maybe you're not convinced that sin is even a real thing. Again, I'm mindful that there may be non-Christians in the room, and by the way, thank you for being with us. But if you're not convinced that sin is even real, okay, fine. But we've all, Christian or not, we've all experienced those feelings of being unclean, of shame, right? From a very young age, we've all tasted that there's something beastly and hideous in us that makes us, we fear, unlovable. You don't need to be a Christian to have experienced that. And I guess where do those feelings come from? Is a question I would pose to you. For Christians, it makes complete sense why we experience those feelings, why everybody experiences those feelings. Of course, you'd feel ashamed and ugly and unlovable. To us, it's like, what else would you expect from trying to live your life never speaking to the one who gives you life? For us, it's like, well, yeah, what would you expect trying to maintain this image of yourself that you're a good person while routinely ignoring what you know is right and wrong? It makes sense to us why these feelings are there. And so I guess I just want to say, friend, if you have never done what this leper did, if you have never come to Jesus Christ acknowledging that and confessing that you are unclean, that you are a sinner, that you are guilty of disobedience and rebellion against God, when I read this passage, like Christ's compassion here, I feel like it would be kind of uncompassionate of me to not say to you, your soul is diseased. You have a sickness in your soul. Your soul is disfigured and increasingly deadened. And it's not just that, because when people think of sickness or being sick, that doesn't capture the biblical picture of guilt, right? It's not just that we're sick with sin. It's that we are sick with sin. We have this disease kind of our own accord. We contracted it of our own accord, which makes us guilty. And so the longer you deny your sickness, or the longer you buy the idea that Jesus Christ is one cure among many, the more your disease and your guilt are going to spread. Until one day, there's a image of this in the book of Hebrews. One day you're going to find that you can't actually approach God anymore, even if you wanted to. And that is a terrifying thought. But okay, so maybe you're on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And here, I want to camp out here for a minute, because this is quite dear to my heart. For you, maybe you don't need any convincing that sin is real. or that you're riddled with it. You don't need any convincing that because of it you're guilty and liable to suffer the wrath of God as punishment for your sin. You don't need to be convinced of that. You believe all of it. Okay? And yet you still won't come to Christ. You still won't follow this leper's example of crying out, "If you are willing, you can make me clean," because you're too busy crying out, "Unclean, unclean, unclean, unclean." Don't get me wrong, this passage and many others teach us that nobody comes to Christ to be cleansed without first acknowledging and confessing that they are unclean, that they are a sinner, that they're guilty. Okay? But it's possible to become so convinced that your condition is terminal that you won't come to Jesus for fear of the bad report, for fear of being turned away. There's nothing I can do for you. I'm sorry. You can spend so long looking at the hideous beast in the mirror that you won't even risk a glance at Jesus for fear of catching him flinching or cringing or recoiling at the sight of you. I know a woman like that. I've shared the gospel with her many times, and I've tried to articulate it in many different ways, so hoping that one way might click for her. And it's not that she doesn't believe it. She does believe it. Rather, her response is always, "Corey, you don't know what I've done in my life. It's too late for me. I've done too much." And if that's you, please hear me. You are not too far gone. This man was, the text says he was full of leprosy. Not just he had a little bit. Okay? In the words of the great Christian rock band Relient K, if you'll believe me, it means you'll have to disbelieve yourself. This leper, if that is you, if even hearing me now, you're still like, I get it. I get the gospel. It's just, if you could hear what I've done, this leper defies you. Jesus was willing to touch this man, this unclean man. And this man got the cleansing he asked. Doesn't that, even a little bit, doesn't that tell you something about your prospects if you would just come to Jesus Christ? We take very seriously here at King Stable Church the reality that we are ambassadors for Christ, that we are his representatives on earth. And so if you are nervous, non-Christian person kind of just looking in from the outside, if you are nervous about exposing your ugliness, bringing your leprosy, bringing your sin and exposing it here, please don't be. You can come to us with your sin, even the sins you hide from your best friend, from your spouse, from yourself. We will not recoil. We will reach out. King Stable Church. I want to end by speaking directly to you and to me. Do you want them to believe that about us? Do you want them to believe that about us? Do you want them to do that here with you? Okay, well then a few things for us. You cannot expect them to feel safe doing so, bringing their sin to you, to this church, to this room, if you hide and downplay your own leprosy, your own ugliness, your own sin. What hypocrisy. When you confess, hear me out here, when you confess your sins to a brother or sister in the faith, do you speak of it in vague generalities? In your accountability groups, you'll confess I've been struggling a bit with lust lately. But does anyone in your life know just how many times you've watched pornography this week or lusted after your coworker? Or is that just too much? I can't share that. We'll confess, or you'll confess, I was impatient with my children yesterday. I can't put myself in that category. I don't have children. You'll confess, I was impatient with my children yesterday, but you'll keep back the particulars that actually you screamed at them just because they embarrassed you at the grocery store. You know? There are some people who work at grocery stores here, and I wonder if you've ever heard that. It may be, just hear me out, it may be that there are non-Christians in our lives who are, they've been coming for a bit now, and they're starting to buy it, and they are desperate to kind of rid themselves of this crushing weight of their hidden sins once and for all. But they see no room for sinners as bad as they are here. Because all they see is kind of the little imperfections that we let them see. Don't rob your family, us. Don't rob your family. I'm talking to myself here too. Don't rob your family of the gift of bearing one another's burdens. Don't rob your family of the joy of looking into a brother's eyes as he confesses his awful sin and pronouncing over him the pardon of Jesus Christ. It is such a thrill to be able to do that and hug him. You'll never know that joy. He'll never know that joy if it was just, we keep it surface level. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, says it better than I ever could in his book Life Together, which I know, Spence, you're reading. He says, it may be that Christians, notwithstanding corporate worship, common prayer, and all their fellowship and service, may still be left to their loneliness. The final breakthrough to fellowship does not occur because, though they have fellowship with one another as believers, they do not have fellowship as sinners. We dare not be sinners. Many Christians are unthinkably horrified when a real sinner is suddenly introduced, suddenly discovered among the righteous. So we remain alone with our sin, living in lies and hypocrisy. Don't be afraid of bringing all your sin into the light. It might just be that you end up bringing along with you a non-believer who's been waiting for the chance to do the same. 2, some of us genuinely struggle. I'm aware that some of us genuinely struggle to be compassionate when we come face to face with really ugly sin. I have been there before. Instead of compassion, it would be anger that would well up in me. I doubt I'm out of that woods yet, actually. Well, that's sin too, right? Confess that. Confess that to God. Confess that to a brother. The remedy for that, okay? The remedy for that is very simple. Remember the condition you were in. Remember your leprosy that he cleansed you of. Remember how sinful you were and are, and he loved you. Again, I couldn't hope to say it better than a man I admire, John Newton. He said in one of his sermons, "Whoever has tasted of the love of Christ and has known," he's talking about believers, "and has known by his own experience the need and the worth of redemption, he is enabled, yea, he is constrained to love his fellow creatures. He loves them at first sight and will feel the warmest emotions of friendship and tenderness towards him." He loves them at first sight. Don't you want to be like that? I want to be like that. I want to love people at first sight with all the affections I feel when I see like Max or Bryce or my friends that I've known for a long time. And if you routinely remember what you were like when Christ saved you, touched you, reached out and touched you, I promise you, you will grow in love and compassion for people. The response of anger and disgust will fade. Lastly, Christian, if we want our non-Christian friends to believe that they can bring their brokenness and their sins here to us, to this church, and that we won't flinch or recoil, then you need to follow your master's lead here in verse 16. Verse 16, where am I? Yet he often withdrew to deserted places and prayed. If you want them to come to you, if you want compassion to be the first thing that wells up in you when they bring their sin and their darkness to you, like, guys, sin is draining and life is hard and ugly. And there's really only so much that a child of light, a Christian, can take before it just weighs you down. You start to feel dirty yourself. The antidote is withdrawing to be alone with the Lord. It's not complicated. He will remind you of your own ugliness. He will remind you of his great love for you. He will remind you how patient he is when you stumble and stumble and stumble. And so you'll be replenished with love for him and compassion for your fellow man and woman. The narrator asked the question, who could ever learn to love a beast? Right? And G.K. Chesterton derived from the story the lesson that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. Until you come to terms with the fact that you are naturally unlovable. I'm not sure if you've ever been told that before, but you are. If you don't believe that, I'm sorry, you just don't know yourself well enough. Your mirror is smudged or something. You will never learn this lesson until you realize that we are all naturally unlovable. You will never be able to love someone before they are lovable. But Jesus Christ came to the earth to give his life as a substitute for sinners because he loves the unlovable lepers. Every Christian in this room is a witness of that. Because his compassion transforms the ugly. Because as the great physician, his cleanness is more contagious than our disease.